needed to know what was wrong. I had to find out what it was. And
the first thing I wanted to have is no toxic cleaning products.
Just because you have brain change doesn't mean you can't still do things. You may do it differently. You might need more time.
I decided to turn my disability into my ability, and around 7th and 8th grade, I started playing able-bodied sports.
If we were knowledgeable, if we were educated, we would have solved science earlier. Now
you battle for every single inch of help.
Like, for example, if James's head is bothering him, he has peppermint essential oil with a roller top on it, and he knows to roll his head, but he has to be prompted and reminded.
A New Perspective, hosted by Tim Sutton. Brought to you by A Better Understanding, bringing you a better understanding and a new perspective on disabilities.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Sutton bringing you a new perspective. If you haven't joined us before, hopefully you're in for a treat today, and I'd encourage you to go back and look at some of the other episodes for the past few years. And if you're not familiar with me, I'm a retired law enforcement officer in the state of Virginia, and had 33 years in that uniform, and about 25 of those years I spent working with a lot of families who are dealing with disabilities, most of whom were traveling the journey of autism, intellectual disability, and Alzheimer's dementia. And I've traveled across the country for about 20 of those years, training other public safety officers, law enforcement, to understand autism, intellectual disability, Alzheimer's, dementias, and things. And one thing that I had noticed as I started meeting the families back in about 2003 that were dealing with loved ones who were on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, is officers were needing training to understand autism spectrum disorder. I began to realize, as I heard the radio calls coming out each night, my deputies were responding, that we were dealing with a lot of calls for service that were directly related to autism, because a lot of times that child with autism is going to grow up to be an adult with autism. Actually, all the time. They are going to have autism for the rest of their life, and some of the behaviors and things might be able to be worked on through intervention to calm some of the situations down. But officers were responding to individuals who were having the meltdown, or we got dispatched to the domestic. We got there, we reverted back to our training. However, most of us had not been trained on autism to understand those behaviors and how to get into that situation and revert back to some type of training to do our job more effectively. We were doing the best we could. So I have, for years, thought law enforcement should have autism training, especially with the CDC right now. 1 in every 36 births is resulting in autism. And last week's show was actually, I gave a little bit of a lesson on autism to give you a better understanding of why it's imperative to understand, for law enforcement officers to understand. Well, it finally came to fruition. My guest today has been instrumental in this. I've talked to her a couple times over the past few years, and she and a bunch of other people have been able to get a law passed here in Virginia to make it mandatory for law enforcement in the state of Virginia to receive autism training. So what I'd like to bring on now, just to have a conversation about how all this transpired and where it's going to lead, Miss Rose Nevill. She's at the University of Virginia. She's the director of Autism Research Corps. And welcome to the show. I just wanted to get you out there and explain what this is all about. And, I personally have a passion for getting out there and training people to understand autism. And I just like for you to share with everybody what brought you to this point to really push for this bill to be passed.
Great. Thanks for having me, Tim. I think this is a topic that has become near and dear to my heart. I think initially I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I work conducting autism research at the University of Virginia. But prior to that, I have an uncle on the autism spectrum who also has epilepsy. And so when he has seizures, he can become quite violent in the aftermath, and he regularly requires emergency response intervention. And through some of those experiences, I've also heard firsthand about how important it is for first responders to have this understanding to be able to respond appropriately to this population. But since joining UVA, I had a few different requests from local emergency response agencies, specifically emergency medical technician councils, to come out and train them on autism. And I think the reason why it's important to think about not only law enforcement, but other branches of emergency response like EMS is because EMS oftentimes plays the role of a patient advocate at a scene and work very closely with law enforcement. And they oftentimes really work hand in hand to help support the patient or the person through a crisis. As I did my first training in 2018 with about 50 EMTs in Central Virginia. And I was really struck by how passionate they were about this topic. I could tell they really cared, that they almost all had individual encounters with someone on the spectrum during a call. And when I was invited back the next year, I found that there was a whole new group of people that I was training. And a lot of agencies rely on wonderful, compassionate volunteers who bring so much value to the team, but unfortunately for them being volunteers, they don't always stick around. And so that started me looking into this topic a little bit more to see how are other agencies and communities training emergency responders, and how are these training programs sustained so that we can ensure that these competencies remain within agencies. So in looking around, I found fantastic training programs such as yours and other trainings in California, Washington State, all over the country. And there's a relatively similar pattern of people with lived experience, either as a parent or family member, who also are in law enforcement or another branch of emergency response, develop these trainings, which are always really well received and have an impact on trainees. However, when the person offering them retires, those training programs aren't always sustained. And so that suggested to me that, I think we need to think about maybe policy change or practice change so that autism education can start to become embedded within these training programs. And that kind of started off some of this.
Yeah. I've done training for EMTs, EMS all over the state, and even the Virginia Department of Emergency Management for the search and rescue teams and stuff. And I even developed a curriculum for the Virginia State Fire Marshal's Office. Whether or not they're using it, I don't know. And my thing, I tell people that, I personally believe anybody who comes in contact with the general public needs to understand autism. My big push with law enforcement was the officers are the ones with the tools that actually hurt people and take lives. So I think it's imperative, because it's very easy to misinterpret a behavior as threatening when it's not. And that officer reverts back to their training. And sometimes people get hurt. Sometimes people get killed. You do a Google search and you can find situations. So that's why I really pushed, or I've really pushed the law enforcement aspect. But I've done a lot of fire, EMS, and if you think about it, they're the ones who respond and have to put their hands on that person to treat them. And if that person's hypersensitive and can't handle being touched, these EMTs, these firefighters, they need to understand autism. Ask before you touch, or don't touch unless you absolutely have to. But EMS, they're in a position where they have to go palpate the body and find out what the problem is. So it's imperative for them as well, and all the firefighters. So I'm thrilled to death you got on board and started pushing the General Assembly, and you were able to get that pushed through.
Thank you. And this was very much a group effort. This was actually led by the Autism Society of Central Virginia. They hired a lobbyist this year to help push this through. And I was grateful to be able to be part of that effort in using some of the data that we've collected through a few studies that I've been conducting on first responder training through University of Virginia, to be able to actually come and say, we have data, we have evidence to show that these trainings can result in significant improvements in not only knowledge and understanding of autism, but first responders' confidence in responding to someone on the spectrum, and self-efficacy, and that generally people like the trainings. And so that was, so we used some of that information to support those efforts, as well as build a pretty broad network. When the bill was first being reviewed by the House, this was back in February, I was so impressed by how many law enforcement officers were more than willing to testify in favor of this bill, yourself included. But I had, just through a few phone calls and texts, 7 to 8 different leaders in law enforcement across Virginia who were ready to testify and speak to the importance of this bill. And I think that also, helps emphasize how important this issue is.
Well, anybody who's got any experience in law enforcement, I mean, they can tell you how many calls and the situations that they've run across, and they can tell you how beneficial it is. The tough thing I found was, some of your administrators in some agencies have been there in a long time. Back then, they were dealing with autism, but they didn't know they were dealing with autism a lot, I think. But now when you talk to the officers out on the road, they can tell you how important it is to understand. And with the numbers being as they are for autism, I found that many officers have a family member or a child with autism. And they're some of your best instructors too, because they've got the professional experience and they've got the personal experience. And I'll always look for opportunities to get them in front of an audience to share their information. What are there some stats that stand out to you, just off the top of your head, that you can share with the audience as to why it is so important to have public safety trained?
Yes, so the data that's come out in the last few years has shown that children on the spectrum under age 21 have on average 5 encounters with emergency responders, primarily police. So 5 times on average by the time you reach 21, that's pretty substantial. Most commonly, first responders, through our research and from the research that I've read, are involved because of to help with an elopement situation where someone on the spectrum has wandered away or ran away from home or school, or where it is they live around the community, and they need help. Their family or their support team needs help finding them. And this is very concerning because a report that came out in, I believe, 2019 from Autism Speaks showed that drowning is one of the top 3 causes of preventable death, in people with autism. And drowning typically occurs after someone has eloped. So it's a huge safety concern. We also know that in adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autism, are 7 times more likely to have an encounter with an emergency responder than the neurotypical population. So there's such a huge, so your comments about how most people in law enforcement or in other branches of emergency response have had these encounters. It's true. It's not a matter of if you're going to have these encounters. It's a matter of when. And when they do, we need to make sure that they have the right knowledge and skills to be able to identify autism, recognize it, because many people don't feel comfortable disclosing their autism. Many people prefer to not label themselves with that because they're afraid of that stigma. And so emergency responders, law enforcement, they need education not only on how to support someone, but they also need education on how to recognize autism.
Yeah, and the stigma I express in my classes is that, like you said, the families a lot of times do not want to call 911. They're dealing with situations, and the last thing they want is 1, 2, maybe 3 police cars pulling up in the driveway, because they're already under scrutiny by the neighbors, because they may have that child or an adult who goes out in the front yard and lays on the ground, beats their head and screams. So they don't want that attention drawn to them. So when they do call 911, those officers need to realize when they respond, they're responding to a crisis. It is a crisis situation. And even for firefighters, I've tried to express that, and families can actually, most jurisdictions, fire, EMS, and police are dispatched to the same dispatchers, but most places allow families to call, and they will put notes in the CAD system, the computer system, so that if they call that number, it comes up on the screen, or call from a number, it comes up on the screen, and their notes. You could say there's an individual with autism living here. Please do not turn the sirens on. They have issues with bright lights or flashing lights. And I said on the fire end of it, if that upstairs back bedroom has an individual with autism, that's where they sleep. When they get stressed, their safe place may be that closet in that room. So if they were to wake up and smell smoke, where would anybody likely believe that they're going? They're going to that closet. Now, wouldn't it be nice for the firefighters to be told en route to the call, there's an individual with autism, they're in this bedroom. When they get stressed, they go to this closet, because that's probably where they are. So those firefighters know we've got to get to that closet, and it's going to be a fight. There's trying to take somebody out of that room, but that's information. And it's so key that families disclose this information. We, talking public safety, need to have information when we respond. And yes, the drowning issue is huge. And I would always tell my officers, when they eloped, get to the closest water. I don't care if it's a bathtub in somebody's backyard that's full of water. Get to the water sources immediately. So what other aspects? Just share some more. Just keep sharing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you've just shared is consistent what I've heard as well. We did after I started thinking about this need for figuring out sustainable programs, I was also interested in understanding what the evidence base for programs was, being that my background is research. And I wanted to see if there was a way that we could develop a community-informed training program that incorporates the perspectives of first responders, autistic people, autistic adults themselves, and then their families into kind of a evidence-based training program that incorporates best practice for de-escalation along with community perspectives. And so through that, we did some focus groups with each of those 3 groups. The first responder group that we met with about approximately 17 first responders representing all branches, so dispatch, law enforcement, EMS, fire, rescue. We asked them, what are their experiences responding to someone on the spectrum? What do they want to know when they're responding to a call? And how do they want to be trained? What's the best way to train them? And so what we heard from them was a similar few themes that you just touched on. One of them was they most commonly respond to elopement, so water sources. That's one of the first things they want to know. And when we're thinking about water sources, we also want to be specific, be creative. Don't just ask, where's the nearest water source? Ask, where's the nearest swimming pool, hot pool, bathtub, lake, creek, river, because families oftentimes, by the time they call, because they typically don't want to call 911, they're afraid of what type of response they get. They've typically been trying to either de-escalate the person for a long time or find them for a long time, and they're exhausted. And so they're going to need a lot of help kind of generating all of that information. So remembering that, the few themes that also emerged as we spoke with first responders, which were really encouraging to me because they actually were very consistent with the themes that popped out from the autism the autistic adult group and the caregiver group, was top 2 probably themes that popped out were sensory issues. So cut the lights, think about how much sensory input we're providing when you're arriving at a scene, multiple responding units rushing in, stomping, talking loudly, deep voices, the flashing lights, the sirens, all of that is so overwhelming for anyone.
Right.
And then someone with sensory issues, it's even more overwhelming. So all of those groups identified the need to really pay attention to that, understand the person's sensory needs, and take those into account. And then the other really big area that popped out was understanding the best way that the person can communicate. First responders said, before I get to a scene, I want to know if the person is verbal or nonverbal. Nonverbal, I say that in quotation marks because just because you don't use spoken language doesn't mean you're nonverbal. You have a way to communicate, whether it's, and you know this very well, if it's
Feeling.
device, gestures, things like that. So if they do not communicate verbally, or if they do, and then what are their communication systems? And so using the household registration or the premise registration form, putting in a CAM note, all of those strategies are so important. And so what we're trying to do as part of our training program through UBA is to also teach first responders about resources that they can be using to improve their response or support their response, and also resources to be sharing back with community members. That being the big one is register your phone number, your address, and share all of the most relevant information that would be most helpful for responding units to have as they arrive at a scene.
And also, talking to the bringing everybody together, we can train public safety all day long, but the parents as caregivers need to be taught how to teach their loved one how to interact with us when we respond. And I love the meet and greets and the community events where you can bring people in because they get to see the uniforms, they get exposure to the uniforms, and the individuals on the spectrum can see that, okay, that uniform is my friend. And some of these tracking systems are out there to help with the elopement, where if they get lost, officer can come out and track them and find them and bring them home. One of the best parts about the one that my agency had used was once a month, an officer would go to the house and meet with the family, and they would take the transmitter, change the battery, and they gave them an opportunity to interact with that individual where, I told you the crisis situation, and with the need for, with autism is routine and structure, having a crisis situation where that individual's never seen law enforcement, it's crisis, and here comes another element they're not familiar with. So getting out there and doing the meet and greets and just getting to know the community and letting your child or adult with autism interact with an officer, I think it goes a long ways to helping resolve that crisis when the time comes.
I completely agree. And I love those events as well. I know there are a few in our community. One of our main collaborating agency, the Thomas Jefferson EMS Council, is actually as a follow-up to the training that we've been developing, creating opportunities for trainees to go to the local autism school via Virginia Institute of Neurodevelopment to meet with the students there and observe them a little bit. And that gives the students the opportunity to see someone within a uniform as well. I agree. I think that's such an important step because we know that change is something that the autism community struggles with, something out of routine. And a uniform is out of routine and it's intimidating. And so creating those opportunities for familiarization are really
right. And we who wore the uniform every day kind of get a little complacent to that. I mean, it's just, when I would come over dinner, my kids would see me in uniform, and it was just what it was. But not everybody gets to see that uniform. And I think parents teaching their loved ones how to interact with us don't, I tell officers, I said, do not invade their personal space. However, they will come up and invade your personal space. Just, never jeopardize your officer safety. But, having the parents, caregivers teach them, don't walk up to that officer and start touching things on their belt and simple things like that I think a lot of people don't think of. And then knowing if you're able to have those meet and greets or you have these frequent encounters, knowing that person's what I call fixations. What do they love? What are their interests? Because I've got one boy that I dealt with probably 20 years. And if I needed some information from him, I knew his fixation. One of his fixation was the Baltimore Orioles. I was not going to get any information from him about anything unless I started talking about the Baltimore Orioles. So that's a good lead-in conversation. But just getting to know people in the community and people with autism, and being able to go up and strike up a conversation that's going to pull them in. And then they might tell you, they might have seen that crime that just happened. They may have every bit of information right here, but unless I can appeal to their interest and draw them in, I'm not going to get that information.
Right. And that is something that I've also been focusing a lot on in our training and our teaching, is understanding what their interests are, because those be tools, like you said, to help connect with them, to help them feel comfortable with opening up to you. It can also help you figure out where they are if they've eloped, because I've worked with people before who have eloped not just towards bodies of water, but also Walmart, because their special interests were balloons, and they knew that they could get balloons at Walmart. Or another person, special interest was comic books. So the first thing that law enforcement officer responding to that call did was drive to the closest comic book store, and that's where he found them. So understanding the person's interests, as well as, on the other end of that, are there any topics or items that set them off or are really agitating? That is also really critical to know, because that could be, if you unfortunately have something at the scene or in your toolbox or something that could really distract them, get them agitated, or someone really hyperfixates up on that, they get further distressed. That's also really important.
Yeah, and to speak to that, I think she's probably 22, 23 years old now, but a young lady and on the spectrum. And years ago, she had some trauma in an ambulance. So if we would interact with her, if an ambulance pulled up, you could just see her. She would start stemming and getting very agitated. But that was one of those things we knew, unless we needed rescue, do not have rescue respond, because it's going to make the situation that much worse. And like I said, it's all about educating, and there are officers out there doing the best they can, but you don't know what you don't know. If you have not been taught this, you're not going to be able to revert back to that part of your training. And that's what I try to do, is just, it's great information to have, to be told on the way to the call that the person is on the spectrum. But there are so many instances where we're going to run across people, whether it's a traffic stop. When we passed JP's law back in 2013, where they can have an identifier on the back of their driver's license or ID, say ASD/ID, it's given through DMV. If you haven't been taught it, you're not gonna know any different, and you're just gonna revert back to that training. But it's a great step, and it's something that's out there through DMV. But yeah, just training people to maybe pick up on whether it's stemming, just a behavior that might make that light bulb go off in your head and say, well, wait a minute, this might be what we're dealing with. We may be dealing with autism. And then you can just hopefully have smooth sailing. You're going to have to work at it. And you might not be the best officer for that call. It might take another officer, understand your limitations. But no, I love what you all have done through the Autism Society and everything. And if there's one takeaway that you would like to give to our audience, my big thing is just let these families know we're advocating for them. Let these individuals know we're advocating. Is there one takeaway that you would just want everybody who watches this to take with them?
I have so many takeaways. Can I have multiple?
We'll get you back on again.
Okay, that sounds good. I think for people on the spectrum and their families, I think we're working hard in different groups to try to advocate for them, at different levels, to make sure that emergency responders as well as the state level understands their needs, and that we start thinking about those more as we, create training programs and competencies. But, if we're thinking about negative experiences. I worry about people who don't want to call 911 because they've had a negative experience in the past, or they're afraid of what kind of response they're going to get. And it's well within the right of someone on the spectrum or their family to call after a response. If they had a negative experience, call that agency and let leadership know, because that is such a critical step to highlighting to leadership that maybe this is an agency where further training or education is needed. And I think, to speak to the sort of intimidating nature of that uniform, I think a lot of people assume that they shouldn't do that, or they are afraid to follow up with agencies if they had a negative encounter. So don't be afraid to speak up and share your stories, because there are different states across the US that are trying to pass similar bills right now. And I think that when we went about this round, it was it was kind of a smooth process. When the bill was reviewed, there were no votes against it. Everybody heard it, thought this makes sense, because there have been, I think, enough stories in the media about children or adults getting lost, tragically getting killed during a 911 encounter, and that shouldn't continue to happen. So if we continue to voice these stories and bring attention to them as across communities, I think that can help other states, work towards getting bills passed as well.
Well, it needs to happen. It definitely needs to happen. Well, Rose, I want to thank you for coming on and just talking real briefly about what's going on. I look forward to having you back and talk about, as this whole project proceeds and the training rolls out, just catch us up on all that stuff. But I just want to thank you for taking time to share this with me. If anybody wanted to contact you, is there a good contact just to inquire if they've got more questions?
Yes, my contact information is publicly available online. My email, easiest would be neville@virginia.edu. Okay. But if you wanted to look me up, Rose Nevill, UVA, you should be able to find all of my contact information as well.
Awesome. Well, Rose, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to share this, and definitely want to do this again. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. Have a good day.
Take care. You too. Everybody, I hope you learned something. I even learned stuff that I did not know. I love being able to do that. Every time I teach, go away knowing something more than what I had in my head when I went in there. So this bill is rolling out. We're getting officers ready to start some training, get the curriculum together, and just trying to safeguard all those precious people in our community. So thank you for watching. Hope you learned something. And Dad, I love you. Thanks for watching.